In the summer of 1942, as Europe burned in the largest war the world had ever seen, Joseph Stalin waited for something he believed the survival of the Soviet Union depended on. A promise from Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt that the Western Allies would finally open a second front in France. For months, Stalin had pleaded, pressured, and demanded. The Red Army was taking unimaginable losses, millions dead, entire cities destroyed, whole divisions erased in days. The Germans controlled vast stretches of Soviet territory, and the Wehrmacht was driving deep toward the Volga and the Caucasus oil fields. Stalin felt the USSR was carrying the full weight of the war alone. And when Churchill and Roosevelt finally assured him the second front was coming, Stalin's reaction, what he said, what he thought, and how he judged the promise revealed not only his strategic mind but his deep mistrust of the West, his political instincts, and his understanding of power. To understand why Stalin cared so fiercely about the second front, we must go back to the catastrophe unfolding around him. The first year of Operation Barbarossa had shattered the Red Army. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and captured in Kiev, Vyazma, Bryansk, and Smolensk. The losses were so immense that even Stalin, who rarely showed vulnerability, admitted privately, "We have suffered a terrible disaster." The Soviet Union lost more men in the first 6 months of the invasion than the United States would lose in the entire war. Stalin knew Germany's industrial power was immense. He knew Hitler meant to annihilate the Soviet state entirely. And he knew that unless Britain and America relieved some of that pressure, the USSR might not survive. Throughout 1941 and early 1942, Stalin's messages to Churchill were pointed, urgent, and increasingly frustrated. He demanded the opening of a new Western Front in France, arguing that only an Allied landing would draw enough German divisions away from the Eastern Front to give the Red Army room to breathe. Churchill, though sympathetic, hesitated. Britain was still recovering from the disasters in France, Greece, Crete, and North Africa. The British military believed they were not yet ready for a cross-channel invasion, but Stalin did not believe this. He saw hesitation as political cowardice, and perhaps worse, a lack of true commitment to defeating Germany. By mid-1942, the Battle of Stalingrad was beginning. German forces were pushing deep into southern Russia. The Volga River was at stake. The oil fields of the Caucasus were next. If the Germans reached Baku, the Soviet Union would starve for fuel. Stalin felt cornered. And in that moment of crisis, the Allies arrived with assurances. When Churchill traveled to Moscow in August 1942 to meet Stalin in person, he walked into a room thick with tension. Stalin was sitting at a table, smoking his pipe, staring coldly as Churchill approached. The British Prime Minister began by expressing admiration for Soviet resistance and reaffirming Britain's commitment to the alliance, but Stalin cut him off. "The Red Army is doing all the fighting," he said. "You must open a second front this year." Churchill winced. He had to tell Stalin the truth. There would be no invasion of France in 1942. The British believed they lacked the landing craft, the air superiority, and the logistical capacity to guarantee success. Any premature assault, they argued, might end in catastrophic failure like Gallipoli or Dunkirk. Churchill explained that Britain was instead attacking in North Africa, preparing Operation Torch, but Stalin dismissed it as a sideshow, far from the German heartland. "A second front must be in France," he insisted. "Not Africa." The room fell silent. Churchill later wrote that Stalin's glare was like steel. Stalin said, "You are afraid of fighting the Germans." Churchill bristled with anger, insisting Britain had stood alone against Hitler for 2 years. But Stalin remained unmoved. His people were dying by the thousands every day. Every minute of delay meant more Soviet cities burning. It was only after Roosevelt intervened sending messages that the United States supported the idea of a 1943 invasion that Stalin softened. Roosevelt affirmed that America was building the greatest amphibious force in history, preparing for what would eventually become Operation Overlord. Though the timeline remained uncertain, the Americans reassured Stalin that France would be invaded, and that the Soviets would not bear the burden of the war alone. What Stalin said after receiving these promises was telling. To Churchill's face, he simply nodded and said, "Good, then let us speak of victory." His tone was calm, even polite. But privately, Stalin's comments were sharper. He confided to his inner circle that he doubted Churchill's sincerity. "The British always try to let others do the fighting," he said. "They want Germany and Russia to exhaust each other. In Stalin's worldview shaped by revolution, civil war, and paranoia, international diplomacy was never about trust. It was about power. He believed Churchill wanted to defeat Hitler, but he did not believe the British were committed to sacrificing their soldiers to do it. Roosevelt, on the other hand, Stalin viewed with more optimism. The Americans, he said, were practical people, driven by industry and resources, not by old-world caution. Still, even with Roosevelt's assurances, Stalin remained anxious. The situation on the Eastern Front grew worse. By late 1942, German divisions had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The fighting became hand-to-hand, street-to-street, building-to-building. Soviet casualties were horrific. Stalin read every report personally. He paced through the Kremlin halls at night. He demanded updates every hour. And whenever the casualty figures rose too high, he would mutter, "Where's the second front?" When the Allies finally launched Operation Torch in North Africa, Stalin reacted with mixed feelings. Officially, he welcomed it, sending polite congratulations to Churchill and Roosevelt. But privately, he was unimpressed. He said, "Africa is not Europe." He believed the North African campaign was too far removed from Germany to relieve real pressure on the Soviet front. Yet even he understood that Allied victories anywhere hurt Hitler, indirectly forcing Germany to stretch its supply lines and reinforce distant fronts. By early 1943, after the Soviet victory at Stalingrad, the tone began to shift. Stalin suddenly had leverage. The Red Army had dealt Germany its first major strategic defeat. It was a moment that changed the entire war. And Stalin now addressed the Allies from a position of strength. When Churchill and Roosevelt reaffirmed that a second front would be launched in 1944, Stalin's reaction was different. He was still skeptical, but he was no longer desperate. In meetings with his generals, he said something remarkable. "We will win the war regardless. But if the British and Americans open a front in France, the victory will come sooner." It was the closest Stalin ever came to acknowledging the value of Western help. But he also couldn't resist adding, "I will believe their promises only when I see their soldiers on French soil." Throughout 1943, Stalin received more detailed Allied plans. When Churchill announced that the Allies were preparing Operation Overlord, Stalin responded with an uncharacteristic comment, "Good. Then we will crush Hitler together." His tone was no longer cold or confrontational. It was cooperative, perhaps even hopeful. But he remained cautious. He reminded the Allies repeatedly that their promise must be kept. "The Red Army bleeds," he said. "We bleed every day." A second front is not a political question. It is a question of life and death. As the plans progressed, Soviet intelligence reported that the Allies truly were building massive landing craft, assembling vast fleets, and positioning troops in Britain. Stalin's attitude changed again. He became more confident that the Western Allies were genuinely committed. He even joked during one late-night Kremlin meeting, "Churchill will land in France after all. I bet he will bring his umbrella." By the beginning of June 1944, Stalin was fully aware that the invasion was imminent. When he was informed that D-Day had begun on June 6, he sent a message immediately. "At last, the history of Europe has taken a new turn." Stalin was jubilant in his own reserved way. According to those present, he leaned back in his chair, smoked slowly, and said, "The Allies have kept their word. Now the Germans will know what it means to fight on two fronts." His private remarks were even more revealing. "Hitler is finished now. A child can see it." To Stalin, the Second Front was not only a military development, it was a political transformation. He believed the Soviet Union's position in post-war Europe depended on shared victory. If the Western Allies had not opened a front, he believed they would try to marginalize the USSR afterward. But by fighting together in France, they ensured the Soviets would be recognized as a decisive force shaping the future. After the landings succeeded, Stalin wrote to Churchill, "The sincere efforts of our armies will hasten the inevitable collapse of Hitlerite Germany." Behind the formal language was something deeper: relief, and perhaps a rare moment of trust. Stalin understood that Germany could no longer survive a two-front war. And he believed that Churchill and Roosevelt had finally proven themselves as indispensable partners. Yet Stalin's mind was always calculating. As the Red Army advanced westward, he spoke privately to his advisors. "The faster the British and Americans advance in France, the faster we must move in the East." He saw the Second Front not only as relief but as competition. The future of Europe would be determined by how far each side advanced before Germany's final collapse. Looking back, Stalin's words surrounding the Second Front tell us far more than simple reactions. They reveal his understanding of the war as a political struggle as well as a military one. They show his suspicion of Western motives, his belief that the Soviet Union bore the true burden of fighting Hitler, and his recognition that only combined action could bring the Reich to its knees. When the Second Front finally arrived, Stalin behaved not like a desperate ally but like a strategic equal. He congratulated Churchill and Roosevelt with sincerity, but also with the awareness that the world after the war would be shaped by the victors standing in Berlin. And he intended that the Soviet Union would be there first, if possible. The Second Front ensured that Germany would be crushed from both sides. But Stalin knew it also ensured something else: that the uneasy alliance with Britain and America would soon give way to a rivalry for the future of Europe. In the end, the words Stalin spoke, skeptical at first, cautious later, relieved after D-Day, reflect the complex alliance that defeated Hitler. The Second Front was not just a military operation. It was a promise, a test of trust, and the beginning of the world that would soon emerge from the ruins of the war.